Wehrmacht. Captain examined. Captured. SCR-300 Walkie-Talkie. FM technology. They couldn't replicate. January 17, 1945. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 06:20 hours. The snow fell in silence, each flake dissolving against the frozen mud where American and German blood had mingled only hours before. Captain Friedrich Weber of the Wehrmacht's 12th Volksgrenadier Division knelt beside the body of a young GI, no more than 20 years old, his face turned skyward as if searching for answers in the gray predawn sky. Weber's hands, blackened with frostbite and gunpowder residue, reached not for the dead soldier's rifle or his rations, but for something strapped to his back, a rectangular olive-drab box, foreign and impossibly compact, still warm from the body heat of its former operator. The device weighed perhaps 35 pounds. Its metal casing bore the stenciled designation SCR-300 and a serial number that meant nothing to Weber, but everything to the future of warfare. He turned it over in his frost-numbed fingers, studying the dials, the handset, the telescoping antenna that extended like a promise into the winter air. Around him, the forest held its breath. In the distance, American artillery continued its relentless percussion, each explosion a reminder that this war, this terrible grinding machine of attrition, had shifted in ways Weber's commanders refused to acknowledge. He pressed the handset to his ear, half expecting to hear the voices of the enemy, their casual confidence transmitted through the ether. There was only static, the white noise of empty frequencies. But in that static, Weber heard something else, the sound of a technological gulf his nation could no longer bridge. For 3 years, German intelligence had known about American portable radio equipment. Reports had filtered back from North Africa, from Sicily, from the hedgerows of Normandy, stories of American infantry units coordinating with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. While German company commanders still relied on field telephones, vulnerable wire connections, and runners who died carrying messages that arrived too late, American platoon leaders spoke directly to their supporting artillery, their air cover, their armor. They spoke in real time, across miles, through rain and snow, and the electromagnetic chaos of battle itself. The Americans had achieved what German engineers had declared impossible: truly portable, frequency-modulated voice communication that worked when it mattered most. Weber had been a schoolteacher before the war, mathematics and physics, in a gymnasium in Heidelberg where young minds once pondered the elegant certainties of classical mechanics and Newtonian predictability. He understood enough about radio technology to recognize that what he held in his hands represented a paradigm shift, a fundamental reimagining of battlefield communication. The Wehrmacht had its own radios, of course, the Tornisterempfänger B, the heavier Torn.Fu sets that required multiple soldiers to transport, the vehicle-mounted systems that worked beautifully until the vehicles burned or became mired in mud. But nothing like this. Nothing a single soldier could carry on his back, through forests and across rivers, and still maintain contact with his command structure. He thought of his own experiences with German field radios, the frustration that had become so familiar it was almost comforting in its predictability. The Torn.Fu.B1 that his company had used during the retreat through France weighed nearly 90 pounds without batteries, required constant adjustment to maintain signal, and drifted across frequencies with maddening inconsistency. Its amplitude modulation system, the same technology commercial radio stations had used for decades, was simple to manufacture but fundamentally limited. Static, overwhelmed transmissions. Interference from nearby radios created a cacophony of overlapping voices. The effective range in combat conditions, with buildings, terrain, and electromagnetic interference from artillery and engines, rarely exceeded 3 kilometers. And that was when everything worked perfectly, which it never did. The Americans had solved all of it: frequency modulation, FM rather than AM, a technology German engineers knew about, had studied, had even prototyped in university laboratories before the war. But knowing about a technology and successfully miniaturizing it, ruggedizing it, mass-producing it by the tens of thousands, these were different challenges entirely. The SCR-300 in Weber's hands represented not just engineering expertise, but industrial capacity, an economic engine capable of transforming theoretical knowledge into practical tools faster than Germany could respond. He had read Einstein, had followed the debates in pre-war physics journals about electromagnetic propagation. He understood that FM transmission occupied more bandwidth, but rejected noise, maintained clarity, resisted the interference that plagued amplitude modulation. The theory was elegant. The implementation had eluded the Reich. Weber's mind traveled back to September 1939, to the intoxicating certainty of those first weeks when the Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 27 days, when the world had trembled before German military efficiency. He remembered the confidence, the absolute conviction that German engineering, German discipline, German will would prove unstoppable. The panzer divisions had swept across Europe like a steel tide, and the radio communications that coordinated those attacks, vehicle-mounted systems operated by trained specialists, had seemed more than adequate. Why would infantry need portable radios? Company commanders had field telephones. Battalion headquarters had radio trucks. Messengers could always run between positions. The German way had worked for 6 years of nearly unbroken victory. Except it hadn't, not really. Even in the triumph of 1940, Weber had heard the complaints from officers who understood combined arms warfare, who recognized that the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht coordinated through a patchwork of incompatible systems, that tank commanders often lost contact with their own infantry in the chaos of rapid advance, that the vaunted blitzkrieg succeeded partly because German forces moved faster than their own communication networks collapsed. The victories had masked the deficiencies. As long as the enemy broke and ran, as long as the offensive momentum continued, the inadequacies of German battlefield communications remained theoretical problems, engineering challenges to be addressed after the war, after victory had been secured and the Reich could turn its attention to perfecting rather than merely producing. But victory had not come. The war had metastasized, spreading from Poland to Norway to France to the Balkans to Russia, each new front stretching German logistics and German industry beyond sustainable limits. And then the Americans had arrived, with their incomprehensible industrial capacity, their B-17s darkening the skies over German cities, their Sherman tanks pouring off assembly lines faster than German factories could produce the technically superior Panthers and Tigers. The Americans brought quantity, yes, but also quality in unexpected domains. Not in tank armor or crew training, but in radios, in trucks, in the unglamorous tools of logistical warfare that ultimately determined whether armies advanced or starved. Weber stood, the SCR-300 slung over his shoulder now, its weight distributed across his back through canvas straps designed by engineers who understood ergonomics, who had studied how soldiers moved under combat conditions. He began walking toward his own lines, through the shattered remnants of the Ardennes offensive, past the burned hulks of German vehicles whose crews had expended their last fuel in one final desperate gamble. Around him, the forest was littered with the detritus of defeat. Abandoned weapons, frozen corpses in gray-green Wehrmacht uniforms, the propaganda leaflets American artillery had scattered promising food and safety to those who surrendered. Some of his men had already gone, simply walked into captivity carrying those leaflets, too exhausted and hungry to continue fighting for promises their leaders could no longer keep. He thought about what his superiors would do with the radio once he delivered it to regimental headquarters. Intelligence officers would photograph it, catalog it, eventually ship it back to Germany for examination by technical specialists, Engineers would disassemble it component by component, marveling at the vacuum tubes, the battery configuration, the ingenious frequency selector that allowed operators to switch channels without the lengthy retuning procedures German radios required. They would reverse engineer the circuitry, document the manufacturing techniques, write reports explaining exactly how the UEZ Americans had achieved what German industry had not. And then those reports would join thousands of others in filing cabinets in Berlin and Munich. Technical documentation of enemy capabilities that Germany lacked the resources to replicate. The reality Weber had slowly absorbed over the past year was that German defeat had already been engineered, quite literally, in the machine shops and laboratories of American industry, before most Wehrmacht soldiers even understood they were in an existential struggle. While Germany converted its civilian economy to war production, building tanks instead of automobiles and rifles instead of machine tools, America had built both. American factories produced weapons in quantities that defied German comprehension, while simultaneously developing new technologies, improving existing designs, and maintaining civilian production that kept the American home front prosperous. It was economically impossible, or should have been, yet the evidence arrived daily in the form of American equipment that consistently outperformed German expectations in every category except direct combat capability. The SCR-300 weighed 35 pounds and provided clear voice communication up to 5 miles. The German Tornado FUD-2, the closest equivalent, weighed 60 pounds without batteries and struggled to maintain contact beyond 2 miles under field conditions. The American radio used 18 standardized battery cells that could be replaced in minutes. The German version required a separate battery backpack and complex connection procedures. The SCR-300 was designed for operation by soldiers with minimal training. Company commanders simply handed them to radio men and expected them to work. German radios required specialists, soldiers who attended weeks of technical school and still frequently struggled with equipment that failed under combat stress. But the differences went deeper than specifications and weight. Weber had captured American technical manuals along with the radio, waterproof booklets written in clear, straightforward English with illustrated diagrams that any competent soldier could follow. The manuals assumed the operator was intelligent but not an engineer, capable of basic troubleshooting but not circuit-level repair. American military doctrine accepted that equipment would break and planned for it, designing systems that could be maintained by ordinary soldiers rather than requiring factory-level technical support. German manuals, by contrast, were written by engineers for engineers, dense with technical terminology and theoretical explanations, assuming a level of expertise most Wehrmacht radio men simply didn't possess. This philosophical difference extended throughout American military equipment. Their rifles were adequate rather than excellent, but they never jammed. Their tanks were inferior in armor and armament to German designs, but they ran for thousands of miles without breaking down. Their aircraft often couldn't match German fighters in performance, but they filled the skies in numbers that made individual superiority irrelevant. The Americans had embraced a different engineering philosophy: reliability over peak performance, maintainability over complexity, mass production over artisanal perfection. It was a philosophy that matched their industrial culture, their pragmatic approach to problem-solving, their democratic assumption that ordinary people could master sophisticated tools if those tools were designed with ordinary people in mind. Weber recalled a conversation from 1942 before Stalingrad, when the outcome of the war still seemed uncertain. He had been stationed in occupied France, training replacement troops, and had befriended a Luftwaffe signals officer who had studied electrical engineering at the Technical University of Munich. Over schnapps one evening, they had discussed the American SCR-300, which had recently appeared in North Africa. The signals officer had explained the theoretical advantages of frequency modulation, had sketched circuit diagrams on a napkin, had acknowledged that German engineers understood the principles perfectly. "So, why don't we build them?" Weber had asked. The signals officer had smiled sadly. "Because FM receivers require more complex circuitry, more precise component tolerances, more advanced manufacturing techniques. We can make a few in laboratories. The Americans make tens of thousands in factories. That's not an engineering problem, Friedrich. That's an economic and systemic one." The implications of that statement had haunted Weber through the subsequent years of retreat and defeat. Germany had entered the war with technological advantages in many domains: better tanks, better aircraft, better tactical doctrine. But technology was not static. It evolved, and the pace of evolution depended on industrial capacity, research infrastructure, and the ability to translate laboratory prototypes into field-deployable equipment. The Americans had systematized innovation, creating an assembly line for advanced technology that could absorb foreign ideas, improve upon them, and manufacture them at scale faster than any nation in history. The SCR-300 was developed in 1940, refined in 1941, and deployed in large numbers by 1943. Less than 3 years from concept to mass production, while German engineers were still debating optimal frequency ranges and battery configurations. Part of the problem, Weber knew, was ideological. The Nazi state distrusted independent thinking, demanded conformity to party doctrine, and had driven many of Germany's best scientists into exile or silence. The Jewish physicists and engineers who had made Germany the world's scientific leader before 1933 were dead, fled, or imprisoned, their expertise now employed by Britain and America. The brain drain weakened every German technical institution, from universities to industrial research laboratories. Meanwhile, American universities churned out engineers by the thousands, educated in a system that encouraged questioning, experimentation, and practical problem-solving. The American scientists who developed the SCR-300 worked in an environment of intellectual freedom that would have been impossible in the Reich, where technical decisions were often subordinated to political ideology, and where Jewish scientists like Einstein, who had revolutionized physics itself, were dismissed as creators of Jewish physics, unworthy of Aryan attention. Weber had been apolitical before the war, concerned more with teaching calculus than with party politics. But the war had politicized everything, including technology. He had watched as competent officers were passed over for promotion in favor of party loyalists, as combat-experienced reports were ignored by ideologues who believed in the power of will over the reality of material shortages. The same institutional rot that led to disaster at Stalingrad and Kursk infected German technical development. Competing bureaucracies, the Wehrmacht, the SS, the Luftwaffe, various party organizations, all pursued separate equipment development programs with minimal coordination. The Luftwaffe developed radios incompatible with Wehrmacht systems. The SS designed vehicles that required different spare parts than standard Wehrmacht equipment. Resources were squandered on wonder weapons, experimental technologies that promised dramatic breakthroughs, but consumed research capacity better spent improving existing equipment. The Americans, by contrast, had standardized ruthlessly. The SCR-300 was designed to interface with every other radio in the American inventory. Its frequencies were compatible with artillery forward observer radios, with armor communications, with air support networks. An American infantry company with SCR-300s could call for artillery support, request airstrikes, coordinate with adjacent units, and maintain contact with battalion headquarters, all using equipment that worked together seamlessly. German infantry could barely maintain contact with their own company commanders, let alone integrate with supporting arms. The communication gap translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. American units could mass firepower at decisive points faster than German forces could respond. could shift reserves to threatened sectors while German commanders were still waiting for runners to deliver outdated information, could coordinate combined arms operations that German forces could only dream of executing. The forest began to thin as Weber approached German lines. He passed an artillery battery, the crew exhausted and apathetic, their guns nearly out of ammunition, their forward observers long since killed or captured. Without observers to spot targets and communicate corrections, artillery was reduced to firing blind concentrations at suspected enemy positions, expending precious shells with minimal effect. American artillery, directed by forward observers with reliable radios, achieved accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to German soldiers who endured it. The Americans would fire a ranging shot, receive immediate radio feedback from their observers, adjust, fire again, and within minutes would be landing shells precisely on target. German artillery procedures, relying on wire communications that were constantly cut by American counter-battery fire, could take hours to achieve comparable accuracy, by which time the targets had moved and the opportunity had passed. Weber reported to regimental headquarters, a farmhouse basement that smelled of mildew and defeat. The intelligence officer, a weary major who had been a patent lawyer in Munich, examined the SCR-300 with the tired recognition of a man who had seen too many examples of American technical superiority. "Another one," he said quietly. "We have 17 of these now. Do you know what Berlin says? They say our engineers are working on an equivalent. They've been saying that since 1943. The major lit a cigarette, his hand shaking slightly. "We can build rockets that fly to the edge of space, but we can't build a portable radio that works reliably. Do you understand the irony, Captain?" Weber understood. The V-2 rocket program consumed resources that might have been spent on thousands of prosaic improvements. Better radios, more trucks, improved maintenance equipment, the unglamorous necessities that kept armies functional. The V-2 was a technological marvel that killed a few thousand British civilians while diverting scientists and materials from projects that might have actually affected the war's outcome. It was a perfect symbol of the Reich's final years, obsessed with spectacular breakthroughs while ignoring the mundane realities that determined whether armies could fight effectively. The Americans had built no superweapons, had pursued no technological moonshots, had instead focused on making everything work a little better, on ensuring that their logistics functioned, their equipment remained reliable, their soldiers were adequately trained and supplied. It was unromantic, unheroic, the warfare equivalent of accounting, but it won wars. The intelligence major had Weber write a report detailing where and when the SCR-300 was captured, what condition it was in, whether he had observed American radio procedures. Weber wrote carefully, knowing his report would be filed and forgotten. One more data point in a cascade of evidence documenting German technological inferiority. As he wrote, he tried to remember the idealism of 1939, the confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow. That confidence now seemed almost quaint, the product of ignorance rather than genuine superiority. The Wehrmacht had been a 20th century army in tactics and doctrine, but had fought with partially 19th century logistics and communication. Against Polish cavalry and French armies, hamstrung by obsolete doctrine, those deficiencies hadn't mattered. Against the Soviet Union's endless manpower and America's industrial might, they proved fatal. He thought about the young American soldier whose radio he had taken, wondered who he had been, what his life had been like before the war. Almost certainly he had been a conscript, drafted from some small town, given a few months of training and shipped to Europe to fight in a war he probably didn't fully understand. Yet that ordinary American had been equipped with technology that no German infantryman possessed, had been part of a military system that assumed ordinary soldiers deserved sophisticated tools, that invested in making enlisted men more effective rather than expecting them to compensate for inadequate equipment through discipline and sacrifice. It was a democratization of capability, a flattening of the technological hierarchy that reserved advanced equipment for elite units. The German military had maintained a more traditional structure. Elite units like the Fallschirmjäger and Waffen-SS received priority for equipment and supplies, while ordinary Wehrmacht infantry divisions made do with whatever was available, often fighting with captured weapons and requisitioned civilian vehicles. This created a two-tier force, where elite formations could sometimes match American units in capability, while the bulk of the German army struggled with chronic shortages and obsolete equipment. The Americans, by contrast, had standardized quality across their entire force structure. Every American infantry division had similar equipment, similar training, similar capabilities. There were no elite divisions in the German sense, no units that received vastly superior resources. This homogeneity created predictability. American commanders knew what any division could accomplish, could move units between sectors without worrying about equipment incompatibility or capability gaps. The SCR-300 was a perfect embodiment of this philosophy. It wasn't issued only to elite units or specially trained communication specialists. It was standard equipment for American infantry companies, operated by ordinary soldiers who might have been farmers or factory workers or students before the war. The Germans could have probably built something comparable for elite formations, could have equipped Fallschirmjäger companies with advanced FM radios if the priority had been there, but they couldn't equip the entire army, couldn't produce sophisticated equipment at the scale the Americans did. So they compromised, giving elite units the best available equipment and expecting everyone else to manage with inferior alternatives, a choice that created capability gaps the Americans exploited ruthlessly. Weber finished his report and left the farmhouse, stepping back into the cold January morning. The snow had stopped, and pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating a landscape of devastation, burned vehicles, hastily dug graves, the frozen corpses of German soldiers who died in the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. The offensive had failed, had been doomed from the start by logistical impossibilities and the Wehrmacht's inability to maintain communication and coordination across a rapidly expanding front. American forces had bent but not broken, had reacted faster than German planners anticipated, had brought overwhelming firepower to bear on German spearheads that advanced faster than their supply lines could sustain. And through it all, American commanders had maintained contact with their forces, had moved reinforcements to threatened sectors, had coordinated counterattacks, all enabled by radio networks that worked when needed most. The Wehrmacht had attacked with 1940s tactics and 1930s communication technology, had expected to achieve through surprise and aggression what it could no longer accomplish through systemic superiority. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the moment when even the most optimistic German commanders could no longer deny reality. The war was lost, had been lost perhaps since the industrial might of the American economy fully mobilized, but certainly was lost now, with Germany's last offensive reserves expended in a failed gamble that achieved nothing except to accelerate the Reich's collapse. Weber walked through his company's positions, saw the faces of soldiers who no longer believed the propaganda about secret weapons and final victories. They were kids mostly, the older men dead or captured, replaced by teenagers and men in their 40s, scraped from the bottom of Germany's manpower reserves. They fought because they had no choice, because the alternative was execution for desertion, because their families were hostages to a regime that demanded loyalty unto death. But they no longer expected to win. They hoped only to survive, to make it to the war's end and somehow return home to whatever remained of Germany after the bombers finished their work. In quiet moments, when he was honest with himself, Weber acknowledged that Germany deserved defeat. Not the German soldiers who suffered and died following orders, not the civilians being incinerated by Allied bombing campaigns, but the Reich itself, the ideological cancer that had metastasized from a fringe movement into state policy, that had launched a war of extermination across Europe and murdered millions in the name of racial purity. He had heard whispers about the camps, the systematic murder of Jews and Slavs, and anyone else the regime deemed undesirable. He had not wanted to believe it, had told himself that such stories were Allied propaganda, but the evidence was too consistent, too widespread. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front spoke of atrocities they had witnessed or participated in, talked about shootings and starvation and cruelty that served no military purpose. If such crimes had been committed in Germany's name, then Germany's defeat was not just military, but moral, a judgment pronounced by history itself. The SCR-300 he had captured seemed almost irrelevant in this larger context, a minor technical detail in a war defined by industrial genocide and civilizational collapse. Yet it mattered precisely because it was minor, because it represented the mundane technological superiority that enabled American victory. Wars were not won by ideological fervor or racial purity or any of the myths the Nazis had peddled. They were won by factories that produced reliable equipment, by logistics systems that kept armies supplied, by communication networks that allowed commanders to coordinate operations, by the 1,000 unglamorous details that separated functional military organizations from desperate mobs in uniforms. The Americans had mastered those details, had built a military machine that emphasized competence over ideology, that valued results over rhetoric, that assumed ordinary citizens could be trained to operate sophisticated equipment if that equipment was properly designed. This was the fundamental challenge the Reich could never overcome. Its ideological insistence on hierarchy and racial superiority conflicted with the democratic principles necessary for truly effective military modernization. The Americans trusted ordinary soldiers with expensive, sophisticated equipment because American democracy was premised on the assumption that ordinary people were capable and trustworthy. The German military, despite its tactical excellence and operational skill, retained an aristocratic structure that concentrated authority and capability at the top while treating enlisted soldiers as interchangeable cogs. That structure worked adequately when the Wehrmacht enjoyed material superiority and faced disorganized enemies. Against the Soviets and Americans, against enemies who mobilized their entire societies and economies, it proved insufficient. Weber thought about what would come next, after Germany surrendered. Assuming he survived, and survival seemed increasingly unlikely as the Allies closed in from east and west, what would his life be like in defeated Germany? The mathematics he had taught before the war would remain true. The Pythagorean theorem cared nothing for human politics. But the students he would teach, if schools even remained standing, would grow up in a Germany occupied and divided, its mythology of racial superiority revealed as murderous fantasy, its claims of technical excellence contradicted by the ruins of its cities and the obsolescence of its military equipment. Perhaps that disillusionment would be healthy, would force a reckoning with the lies that had led Germany into catastrophe. Or perhaps Germans would retreat into victimhood, would blame defeat on betrayal rather than acknowledging the fundamental bankruptcy of Nazi ideology. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the distant thunder of American artillery. The war continued its grinding progression toward conclusion. Weber returned to his duties leading men who no longer believed in victory but still had to fight, still had to maintain some semblance of military discipline even as the structure they served crumbled around them. The SCR-300 was sent to the rear, beginning its journey to German intelligence specialists who would marvel at its design and despair at their inability to replicate it. Eventually, it would be captured by advancing Allied forces, perhaps returned to American hands, the circle completing itself. But the radio's physical journey mattered less than what it represented. A symbol of American industrial and intellectual supremacy, of a nation that had mobilized its vast resources not for conquest, but for the preservation of democracy, that had poured its wealth into defeating fascism with the same ruthless efficiency it brought to building automobiles and refrigerators. The SCR-300 was mass-produced democracy, communication technology designed under the assumption that ordinary soldiers deserved the best tools available, that enlisted men were citizens in uniform rather than subjects to be commanded. That philosophy extended through every aspect of American military organization, from the hot meals served at the front to the medical care that saved wounded soldiers to the rotation systems that sent combat veterans home rather than keeping them at the front until they died or broke. German soldiers who were captured often expressed astonishment at how American prisoners of war were treated, fed adequately, housed in heated barracks, protected under the Geneva Conventions. It contradicted Nazi propaganda about American decadence and cruelty, forced a reconsideration of who the barbarians really were. The contrast between American treatment of prisoners and German conduct on the Eastern Front, where prisoners were starved and murdered and worked to death, revealed more clearly than any technical comparison the ideological chasm between the societies. The Americans could build superior radios precisely because they came from a society that valued innovation and individual capability, that educated its citizens and trusted them with responsibility, that saw technology as a tool for empowering ordinary people rather than concentrating power in the hands of elites. This was the lesson of the SCR-300, the truth that no amount of German engineering expertise could overcome, that technology emerged from social and political contexts, that a nation's military capabilities reflected its fundamental values, that democracies which trusted their citizens ultimately proved more innovative and adaptive than authoritarian regimes that concentrated power and suppressed dissent. The Reich had bet everything on the belief that discipline and will could overcome material disadvantages, that ideological commitment could substitute for industrial capacity, that racial purity mattered more than inclusive excellence. Every American radio on every battlefield testified to the bankruptcy of that belief. April 1945. Ruhr Pocket. The collapse. 3 months after capturing the SCR-300, Friedrich Weber surrendered to American forces. The war in Europe had days remaining. The Reich had contracted to a few desperate pockets of resistance, Berlin itself besieged by Soviet forces bent on revenge. Weber's unit, what remained of it, laid down their weapons in a roadside ditch and waited for American infantry to take them into custody. They were searched, processed, photographed, bureaucratic procedures that seemed almost surreal in their ordinariness, as if surrendering after 6 years of total war was a routine administrative matter rather than the end of everything. Weber was held in a temporary POW camp, barbed wire enclosures in empty fields where thousands of German soldiers waited to learn their fates. The Americans provided food, not much, but more than the Wehrmacht had been able to supply its troops in the final months. There were medical officers who treated sick and wounded prisoners who used antibiotics and surgical techniques that German military medicine lacked. And there were radios, American radios like the SCR-300, used by guards to coordinate security and communicate with headquarters, their antennas visible throughout the camp, their transmissions constant and reliable, a quiet demonstration of the technological gap that had doomed the Reich. In the camp, Weber met German engineers who had worked on radio development, scientists who had understood exactly what needed to be done but lacked the resources and industrial capacity to do it. They spoke bitterly about projects canceled for lack of materials, about designs that worked in laboratories but couldn't be manufactured at scale, about the bureaucratic chaos that had paralyzed German technical development. "We knew," one engineer said quietly. "We knew what the Americans had, knew how far ahead they were. But knowing didn't matter. We couldn't catch up. The gap kept widening." The war ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Weber eventually returned home to Heidelberg, to a city partially destroyed by bombing, to a society trying to understand how it had descended into genocidal madness. He resumed teaching mathematics, watched his students struggle with the same equations that had challenged students before the war, found comfort in the immutability of logical truths. But he never forgot the SCR-300, never stopped thinking about what it represented. The radio he had held in his hands on that January morning in the Ardennes, the symbol of a future that had arrived for the Americans while Germany remained trapped in the past. In classrooms throughout occupied Germany, former Wehrmacht officers taught a new generation about the war, about the tactical brilliance of early campaigns and the inevitable decline that followed. But the deeper lessons, the ones about ideology and society and the relationship between political systems and military effectiveness, those were harder to teach, required a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about what Germany had been and what it needed to become. Weber tried to explain to his students that the war had not been lost through betrayal or bad luck, that Germany had been comprehensively defeated by enemies who had proven superior in every dimension that mattered: industrial production, technological innovation, logistical organization, strategic vision, and, above all, in the values that animated their societies. The Americans had built the SCR-300 not because individual American engineers were smarter than individual German engineers, but because American society fostered innovation in ways the Reich could not. Democracy, with all its messiness and inefficiency, had proven more adaptive than dictatorship, more capable of mobilizing entire populations, more effective at harnessing talent regardless of background or ideology. The engineers who developed frequency modulation technology had worked in universities and corporate laboratories where questioning authority and challenging assumptions were encouraged, where Jewish scientists and Gentile scientists collaborated without regard to racial pseudoscience, where merit mattered more than party loyalty. Epilogue: the symbol that remained. Decades after the war, long after Friedrich Weber had retired from teaching and Germany had rebuilt itself as a democratic state, historians would study the SCR-300 as an artifact of military history, an example of technological innovation that provided tactical advantages to American forces. Technical manuals would explain its circuitry, its frequency modulation system, its impact on battlefield communications. Military analysts would cite it as evidence of American industrial superiority and German logistical weakness. But the true significance of the radio extended beyond technical specifications and tactical applications. The SCR-300 represented a philosophical difference, a divergence in how societies organized themselves and empowered their citizens. It was technology designed under the assumption that ordinary people mattered, that soldiers who carried radios on their backs deserved tools that worked reliably, that democracy extended even to the battlefield in the form of communication equipment that flattened hierarchies and enabled junior leaders to exercise initiative. The radio Weber had captured and examined that January morning became, in his memory, a symbol of why the Reich failed. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, not because German engineers lacked knowledge or creativity, but because the society that produced German soldiers and engineers had embraced values fundamentally incompatible with the demands of modern industrial warfare. The Nazis had built a state premised on hierarchy, racial purity, and ideological conformity. Such a state could achieve spectacular short-term successes through organization and ruthlessness, but it could not sustain the intellectual freedom and social trust necessary for continuous innovation. The Americans, imperfect as their democracy was, scarred by racial segregation and economic inequality, nonetheless had created a society where questioning authority was tolerated, where immigrants contributed to national success, where universities and corporations invested in research that might not yield immediate profits, where ordinary citizens were educated well enough to operate sophisticated equipment. That society produced not just the SCR-300, but thousands of innovations large and small, created a military machine that combined industrial efficiency with tactical flexibility, that could absorb enormous casualties and losses and continue growing stronger as its economy mobilized. In the end, the SCR-300 was more than a radio. It was a verdict, a judgment rendered not by courts or historians but by the material reality of technological capability. It represented the distance between what the Reich claimed to be, the vanguard of Western civilization, the defender of European culture, and what it actually was, an ideologically bankrupt regime that had squandered Germany's intellectual heritage and led the nation to catastrophic defeat. The radio was a reminder that wars are won not by propaganda or racial mythology or claims of cultural superiority, but by the mundane details of logistics and communication, by the thousands of small advantages that accumulate when societies invest in education and trust their citizens with responsibility. Weber died in 1978, having lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt, to witness the economic miracle that transformed the Federal Republic into a prosperous democracy, to understand that the values he had fought against, democratic governance, individual rights, international cooperation, were not weaknesses, but strengths. He never spoke publicly about his war experiences, never wrote memoirs or gave interviews. But in his classroom, teaching calculus and physics to students who would never experience the wars that had defined his generation, he sometimes thought about that January morning in the Ardennes, about the weight of the SCR-300 in his hands, about the young American soldier who had carried it into battle. That radio, or one like it, now sits in a military museum somewhere, preserved behind glass as a relic of a war that ended 80 years ago. Visitors walk past without understanding its significance, see it as just another piece of obsolete equipment, superseded by technologies that would have seemed like magic to the soldiers who used it. But for those who understood what it represented, the industrial might, the intellectual freedom, the democratic values that enabled its creation, the SCR-300 remained a powerful symbol of why authoritarianism ultimately fails when confronted by societies that trust their citizens and invest in their capabilities. The frequency-modulated signals it once transmitted are long silent, the vacuum tubes cold, the canvas straps cracked and faded. But the lesson it taught endures, a reminder that technology is never neutral, that the tools societies build reflect their deepest values, and that in the great contest between democracy and dictatorship, between openness and repression, between trust and fear, the portable radio carried by an ordinary American GI proved more significant than any wonder weapon the Reich could devise. That single soldier, equipped with a radio that cost perhaps $200 to manufacture, could coordinate more firepower, communicate more effectively, and exercise more battlefield initiative than a Wehrmacht company commander whose equipment cost thousands, but reflected a philosophy that ultimately led only to ruins and defeat. The SCR-300 was abundance made manifest, democracy rendered in metal and wire and vacuum tubes, a gift from American factories to soldiers who were trusted with responsibility, who were assumed capable of using sophisticated tools, who represented a nation confident enough in its citizens to place its most advanced technology in their hands. Against that confidence, that trust, that fundamental belief in human capability, The Reich's ideology of hierarchy and racial destiny proved hollow and impotent, revealed as the murderous fantasy it had always been. And so the radio remains, a silent witness to the truth that freedom and prosperity enable innovation, that open societies outcompete closed ones, that the real wonder weapon of World War II was not the V-2 or the Tiger tank or any of the sophisticated systems German engineers developed, but rather the humble portable FM radio that every American infantry company took for granted, the technology that worked when it mattered, built by a nation that understood that wars are won by empowering ordinary people to do extraordinary things,